The Falcons foundation has been built. How strong exactly is it?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the Iron that Sharpens the Iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And, of course, I've been covering the Falcons for too many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer that makes it your first listen or your first watch of the day each and every day. And if you want to become an everydayer, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we will be answering a couple listener questions. We'll talk a little bit about sort of where I project this offense to be. Is it a top 10 unit? Is it a top 15 unit? But we'll sort of initially get there because originally I was going to answer a listener question that was submitted via email from Ali Khan from 2 weeks ago. And he kind of pushed back against the notion you've heard from me in the past about how the Falcons are making all the same bets this year as they were last year. And originally, I actually did sit down and record what wasn't necessarily a rant, but it was basically 15 minutes of me just griping about all my issues with what the Falcons did. And rather than doing that, we're just going to boil it down to, this is not necessarily answering Ali Khan's question, but we'll kind of address it. So Ali Khan, I hope you will take this instead. But basically, when we think about the big bet the Falcons are making this offseason, it's the real bet that they're making is like the core of this offense is a strong foundation. That when you look at this offense and how it's currently constructed, it has the potential for a bright future, right? Where you look at the 13 pieces on offense that you can expect to be regular parts of their offense each and every Sunday, 11 of those pieces are locked up for at least 2 more years, right? Kirk Cousins for 2 years, Bijan and Algier for 2 years, London and Mooney for 2 years, Pitts, now that he's got his 5th-year option, Charlie Warner for 2 years, 4 out of your 5 starters on the offensive line are locked up for 2 years. Basically, the only exceptions out of those 13 guys is Drew Dalman and Rondale Moore, right? And essentially, I think if Drew Dalman plays at the level he's played the last couple of years, he'll probably get re-signed this year. And then that just sort of leaves Rondale Moore as the open question mark. And even if you do come out thinking, oh, man, we got to upgrade the number 3 wide receiver position, that theoretically on paper shouldn't be some massive obstacle. And so you have the potential here where, you may be only looking at 1 or 2 spots on offense. And sort of that's really what this season is about. It's like, how strong is that foundation? Is it as strong as that appears it to be, where this is going to be one of the best offenses in the league, that we're going to be sitting here 6 months from now feeling like, man, this offense is humming and Zach Robinson has this thing humming. And, even if they're not necessarily a top 10 unit at that point in time, it feels like they're on the verge of that, and especially as we've discussed many times before, where it's like your expectations for 2025 with this same unit, everybody should theoretically be better in year 2 if this offense, sort of has that sort of cohesiveness and continuity going into 2025 as they currently seem to have coming out of 2024. Now, defensively, the foundation isn't as strong. You have a decent, solid foundation in the spine of your defense with Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata at D tackle, Kay Nellis locked up for 2 more years. All 3 of those guys locked up for 2 more years. Jesse Bates at safety locked up for 2 more years. On the outside, you're kind of piecing it together. AJ Terrell, we're hoping AJ Terrell gets locked up for more than this next season at some point later this summer. But essentially we'll figure it out. That's basically the strategy. Our offense is going to be our foundation. It's going to be our sturdy foundation, which we can build it off, and we'll figure out the defense. That's basically what the Rams have done, this past year, and they were able to achieve that with a top 10 offense. And you're kind of, the Falcons have you could argue up to 10 second, third, fourth round picks, day 3 guys that at those other positions outside of that sort of spine of the defense that they're just we're going to throw a bunch of that stuff at the wall in these, the Richie Grants, the Rucororos, the DeMarco Hellams, the Clark Phillipses, the Arnold W. Kenny, Troy Andersons, etc. We'll throw a bunch of those guys, and if like 3 or 4 of those 10 things that we throw at the wall stick, we're in a good spot, and we'll figure out the rest, right? And sort of everything kind of hinges on the offense being that foundation, and then they'll figure out the defense. And ultimately, if the Falcons wind up making the playoffs this year, the proof is in the pudding, and they can sit there and declare, we did it, everything's fine. And I certainly want to believe in that. I want to believe that Raheem and company can be Sean McVay, can be Mike Tomlin, our version of those coaches, right? The question I have is, are we going to be sitting here 6 months from now realizing there's a lot more cracks in the foundation than we necessarily expected? And that's going to be a challenge for this team moving forward, because it's not going to be it's not just, we just need to tweak 1 or 2 things in the future, right? And that's one of the reasons why so many people are so optimistic about, Michael Penix's future here in Atlanta and the situation he may be inheriting in 2026 and beyond, and whenever that is, right? Because you're expecting him to inherit the core of this foundation, probably not, all 11 pieces, because some of those guys may be retired at that point in time, but you're kind of hoping like 6 or 7 out of those 11 pieces should be inheriting and needing to tweak, finding a new right tackle to replace Caleb and Gary, finding another wide receiver or whatever, like those are relatively pieces that like are achievable, right? For Michael Penix to sort of inherit the core of this foundation. And that's why we've talked about before, where if this goes right, if this bet pays off for the Falcons, as we all hope and want it to do, we could be sitting here 3 or more years from down the road and looking back and saying, man, the Falcons were so well run as an organization. They were the best run team, and all these bets that they, planted the seeds for or set the table for, paid off for them in a major way. That essentially we're hoping that we're having a conversation in 3 or more years talking about Raheem essentially being Sean McVay to Arthur Smith's Jeff Fisher, right? Where that situation where the Rams and how they were run for, however many years, 4 or 5 years, whatever, that Jeff Fisher was there, versus how they were run, over the last 7 years with Sean McVay, is night and day different. And one of those teams is a team that is, considered a perennial playoff team and has won a Super Bowl, in a potential perennial Super Bowl contender for most of that time. And the other team is just an also ran. And we're hoping we're having that conversation in the future. And I understand why many of you guys, are so upset with Mr. Drew, my alter ego. My friends call me Negative Nancy. You can call me Mr. Drew. You can become my friend by being an everyday or subscribing to the podcast. Let's get to 11,000 by the time we get to the training camp. But, all that stuff and more. And I understand why everydayers, like, you want to hear that positive, optimistic vibe on a daily basis, that sort of outlook, right? And, for me, at least, a lot of it is like multiple decades worth of baggage as a Falcon fan of being like, yeah, I should be excited, but like they always seem to let me down somehow, some way. And that gets to the core of, like, I think that's why some of you guys are wondering, like, how could Aaron, you be sitting here so much more optimistic a year ago when, as Ali Khan said in the email that you guys haven't heard yet, that basically like the bets that they're making this year have much better odds of paying off this year than they did last year. And you were optimistic then, and now you're pessimistic. It doesn't make any sense. And to me, part of that pessimism is rooted in sort of complacency, right? That it's the idea that, to me, this offseason kind of represented a regression of progress that I was hoping the Falcons would make. And I'll explain that a little bit further as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, guys, Game Time is going to make getting NBA Finals tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer you get to tip off. And I know the idea of buying NBA Finals tickets can seem daunting and pretty expensive, but Game Time is doing its best to take the guesswork out of buying tickets and doing what they can to help you save money, because they have last-minute deals that you can save up to 60%, whether you're buying NBA Finals tickets or other sports venues, concerts, comedy, music, theater, whatever's near you. Their lowest price guarantee is going to mean that they'll credit you 110% the difference if you can find cheaper tickets. And their flash deals allow you to save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game. So take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets with Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So before we continue today's episode talking more about my issues with this team's habit of complacency, let's talk about the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel right here on YouTube, as well as the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, where you're getting that can't miss analysis, all the biggest stories and biggest opinions across all the sports on Locked On Sports Today, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So basically, it boils down to my biggest gripe of the Thomas Dimitroff era was the annual complacency that this team went on. And, some of the examples, we can rewind the clock going back to like 2009 offseason where they were basically, oh, we'll just sign Mike Peterson. We're good. 2010, it was like, we'll sign Dante Robinson and we're good. Right. 2011, it was like, we'll trade it all for Julio Jones and we'll sign Ray Edwards and we're good. 2012 was like, hey, Asante Samuel, we'll pick him up for a day 3 pick and we're good. 2013, it was Steven Jackson and Osi Umenyiora were going to be the things that were going to push this team over the hump. And it goes on and on and on. And, actions speak louder than words. And most of those years, the Falcons' actions under Thomas Dimitroff, those 14 years that he was a general manager, was constantly telling us that, like, this team is a Super Bowl team and we're just 1 or 2 pieces away. And basically every offseason, we just need to tweak it, right? And, a couple of times they were very close to reaching that level and winning that Super Bowl. But most of the time they weren't. And it's not because I thought Thomas Dimitroff was a bad general manager, as some Falcon fans would love you to believe, as a way of sort of convincing themselves that Terry Fontenot was a great general manager just by default, right? Which is where that is rooted. Thomas Dimitroff was a good general manager. My personal opinion, he could have been a great general manager if he wasn't so complacent. And what got me excited last offseason was the Falcons didn't operate like a team that, oh, we're just 1 or 2 pieces away. They operated like they were a team that was 5 or 6 pieces away, and they were very proactive in free agency and whatnot to go out and find those pieces. And to me, this offseason, because of all that baggage I carry from the Thomas Dimitroff era, to basically see the Falcons go out there. And again, I know you guys, many of you think that the Falcons did more elsewhere on the roster than I tend to think, but I essentially think the Falcons offseason just boils down to, we're a quarterback away, right? And they doubled down on that quarterback by getting both Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix. And, instead of what we were in the Mike Smith and Dan Quinn years, which was convinced that we were a Super Bowl team, that we just needed to tweak that 1 or 2 things most off seasons to prove that. Now we're sitting here doing the same thing, but like, we're a playoff team and we're just 1 or 2 pieces away from proving that. And I certainly think it's not a crazy argument to say that they are potentially 1 or 2 pieces away from being a playoff team, right? They got 90% of the way there. They were, we talk about them being 10 yards away from the Super Bowl in 2012. They were 7 points away from the playoffs this past year because they lost the Bucks and Panthers game in weeks 14 and 15 by a combined 6 points, right? And if they just score a couple more points in those games, they win those games and they win the division, and they're in the playoffs. And so it's the idea of like, Kirk Cousins, he's gonna fix that, right? And it's fine. Like, yeah, Kirk Cousins would have solved their problems a year ago, but you're not in 2023, you're in 2024. And certainly on paper, the schedule is still easy. And a lot of that is based off of, you're going to play some bad teams in the back half of the season. And time will tell if that proves to be true. We know that. But I think we all look at the schedule and we say, like, yeah, on paper, it's an easy schedule, but it's it's the most challenging easy schedule that we've ever seen, right? And your margin for error isn't particularly large, right? That you have these opening 3 games against Pittsburgh, Philly, and Kansas City. That's not easy. Then you have 5 out of your 6 division games over the next 7 weeks, from weeks 4 to 10. And that's not necessarily easy. And we talked about this all last year. Like, it's not how you start, it's how you finish. And this schedule, again, sets up for you to finish strong. But much like last year, like, I don't think you're going to, I think there's reasons to be optimistic that you're going to win 9 or 10 games and win the division. But I don't think, like last year, it's going to be, you're going to moonwalk to, double-digit wins this year, right? No one should be sitting here thinking it's going to be easy to win 10 games this year, right? That most of these games are probably going to boil down like they always do with the Falcons and constantly did last year with the Falcons, which is they're going to boil down to the last 5 minutes. And, who has the ball last, who can make the plays in those 5 minutes is going to be the team that wins the game. And that sort of razor-thin margin for error is not something I look forward to, guys. I don't enjoy that, right? And that's so similar from last year to this year. And Are we going to be sitting here doing what we've done? Like, you take the upcoming Chargers game that we face after the week in week 13 after the bye week, right? We faced Justin Herbert twice now in his 4 years in the NFL, and each time it has been, the Falcons have the go-ahead score, and there's like a minute left in the game, and Justin Herbert has the ball, and his team goes down the field and scores the point that they need to score in order to win the game. And we're sitting here talking about, we don't get enough pressure on the quarterback, we don't have enough assets on defense, and I'm just like, is it going to be different this year, right? Tell me why it's going to be different when we face the Chargers in week 13, that it's not going to be exactly the same thing this year versus any of the other two previous times we faced Justin Herbert in the last 4 years, right? You tell me it's going to be different. I've been told it's going to be different. This year it's going to be different for 15 years. And I sit here in 2024 basically saying, guys, like, it's a lot harder to convince me just by you saying it in 2024 than it was in 2023 or what it was in 2014 or whatever the case may be. But we'll leave that conversation aside for now. I'm sure there will be plenty more opportunities to talk about what these expectations are for Falcons. But I hope that, explains why I tend to be a little bit more skeptical than the rest of you, because it's just years of baggage that is built up. And it's just like, all right, like I'm not as gullible as I was, a year ago or 10 years ago now, or at least I hope I'm not. And so, like, you have to do a little bit more to convince me now. And I don't know if the Falcons have done quite as much as I would like them to do, but we'll see on that. But speaking of sort of the foundation of this team being a high caliber offense, what is at least my expectations based off of a listener question on what this offense is going to be? Do they have the potential to be a top 10 unit? Do they have the potential to be a top 15 unit? Top 15? Yes. Top 10? We'll see. And we'll break that down exactly why. I have some questions about that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So our last question comes from Noah F. He says, hey, Aaron, sorry, but I meant for it to say Rook instead of Rule before Braylon, but I also want to pick your brain about what do you think this offense is going to perform? I know it's hard to tell because of the whole Kirk Cousins things, but what do you think the Falcons' offensive efficiency will be? Do you think it will be top of the league, middle of the pack, or bottom of the league? Do you think it will change if Kirk somehow got hurt and we have to put in Michael Penix for the year? Sorry for being a nuisance. Just have no one to talk to about sports. And my sister wants to know, what are you projecting Bijan stats to be this year? She's a big Bijan fan. So Noah's originally asked a question about projecting the Falcons sack totals for the three rookies. That's where the Rook Braylon stuff comes from in his question. And we kind of touched upon that last week on the pod about what the average projection, the average guys taken in their rounds would project to about 4 sacks this year. I don't really see a reason at this point to expect significantly more. So maybe we can push it to 6 sacks between that trio of guys, like 2 per. And like that seems reasonable, realistic, but probably not a whole lot more than that. Now, when it comes to the offense, I do expect the Falcons to have a top 15 offense. This feels like an offense that should finish in the top 10 to 15 range. If we go back and look at profootballreference.com and look at how they ranked offenses last year, again, in the expected points, and this is not meant to be an exact science. This is just a gut feeling because that's all we're working with in late May, right? But I just look at the top 15 teams in ranked and sort of compare what I think the Falcons offense is going to be to what those offenses were last year. And the top 3 were San Francisco, Buffalo, and Dallas. Not expecting a top 3 offense. Number 4 is Detroit. And we've mentioned before how, in theory, the ceiling of this team's offense is similar to what the Lions in terms of how they're structured with sort of the 2-headed monster at running back, 1 big time receiver and 1, high caliber tight end. And that could work. But the reason why I'm not expecting the Falcons to sort of be that sort of top 5 offense that Detroit was last year, because Detroit was in year 3 of that whole situation of Ben Johnson and whatnot. And I'm not going into year 1 with Kirk coming off an Achilles, year 1 of Zach Robinson, having those expectations that they're going to be as good as year 3 of Ben Johnson. Now, that's my kind of hope that the floor for this year's offense is going to be good enough that we can then have those top 5 expectations in year 2 of Zach Robinson and Kirk Cousins and all that stuff. That's my hope for this year. That's what we're hoping on, but I'm not expecting it right now. Now, 5, 6, 7, and 8 were Green Bay, Baltimore, the Rams, and Miami. Again, all of those offenses were explosive, dynamic offenses. We're not always consistently that throughout the season. but at various points in the season were among the most explosive offenses in the league. And I don't quite see that yet for this Falcons team. Again, I would love to be wrong on that, but I don't see it right now. So it's really at 9 and 10, which was Philly and Kansas City, where I feel like not where this Falcons team's ceiling is, but where it's real, where their eye level, I guess, is realistic, where I think it's more realistic where they can finish, right? Philadelphia and Kansas City were two good but flawed offenses, right? Where they had two good quarterbacks that had, for what they had shown in previous years, down years for them. And that's kind of where I think the upper level of this offensive potential. So when I think they have the potential to be a top 10 unit, it's kind of similar to what Kansas City and Philadelphia were top 10 offenses, but like, you know, they didn't scream that in terms of like there's a drop from, I think, those top 8 offenses to 9 and 10. Now, really where I feel much more optimistic where this offense is going to be is that 11 through 14 range, where we find offenses last year that were Seattle, Tampa Bay, New Orleans, and Houston, right? That's their sweet spot. Hopefully they'll be better than that. Those offenses were, because 2 out of those 4 teams didn't make the playoffs last year, although they got pretty close. And so like, that's where the sweet spot kind of is for this team. 15 through 17 is Minnesota, Cincinnati, and Indianapolis. And my hope is that we'll be better than those offenses were, because those were offenses that were productive, but spent the bulk of their seasons playing with a backup quarterback. And we're hoping for more out of that than Kirk Cousins. As you mentioned, if Penix is to play a significant amount, would I have the same expectations? No, because I don't generally have high expectations for rookie quarterbacks. I know other people think, you know, I've seen the comments on my YouTube videos of, you know, Penix is better today than Kirk Cousins is right now. And it's like, all right, like if you think that, that's fine. You're entitled to your opinion. That to me remains to be seen. I would love that to be true. But when you look at some of the offenses that had a rookie starting for at least, you know, a quarter of the season or more in terms of their rankings last year in expected points, it was Houston at 14, Indianapolis at 17, Tennessee at 20, Chicago at 23, Raiders at 25, Giants at 29, and Panthers at 30. So hopefully, you know, there's room, there's, you know, the variety, a spread of outcomes, but for the most part, with the exception of Houston, those were all below average offenses. And so if Penix has to start this year, I expect it to be a below average offense, which is typical of a rookie quarterback. Maybe it's closer to 20 than it is to 29. Hopefully, one would hope with Zach Robinson and all the talent we have, or allegedly have. One would hope that, you know, it'll be in the top 20 somewhere still, but time will tell. Now, when it comes to Bijan and projections, you know, sort of, I usually nail in on exactly my projections in like that first week of September, with like the Wednesday before the season starts, usually giving you my exact projections, but we can give some preliminary ones. I've got a couple of listener questions asking sort of projections and whatnot. So with Bijan, like I'm expecting him to get north of 300 touches this year. And if he has, you know, a similar efficiency where he's like a top 10 running back when it comes to yards per touch, which he was last year, he was like 7th last year in that category. And he maintains himself as a top 10 running back in that metric, that, you know, that should be looking at somewhere potentially north of 1,600 yards from scrimmage this year. And I think that probably the ceiling for that is maybe 2,000 yards from scrimmage, you know, and I understand why people are hopeful and optimistic. Again, remains to be seen. Again, a lot of that hinges on Zach Robinson and his play calling. But like that kind of split is like, I expect Bijan to have like 1,000 to 1,200 yards rushing, anywhere between like 600 to 800 yards of receiving is kind of where I'm expecting him to sort of fall into that. And hopefully we'll see a dozen or more, you know, possibly 15 or more, you know, total touchdowns this year. That's what I'm hoping for Bijan. So we'll see about that. And there'll probably be a point later this summer, possibly even next week, where we look at some other people's projections for the Falcons and you know, go over under that sort of thing. So we'll see about that on that. But I hope, Noah, that answers yours and your sister's questions. We'll end it right there. Tomorrow we'll be back with Spencer McLaughlin, the host of Locked On Ducks, to talk with him about Brandon Dorlus, and we'll find something else to talk about as well. Make sure you check out Locked On Sports today, Locked On Sports Atlanta as your second listens. Locked On NFL, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, guys. Your team every day.